Hello, welcome you to the program today. We're continuing our study of the Book of Jonah. So if you will, please turn in your Bibles to Jonah chapter 2. Just as a brief review, Jonah chapter 1, we see in verses 1 through 3 how Jonah attempted to flee from the presence of the Lord. In verses 4 to 16, we see how there was a great tempest on the sea. And Jonah, understanding that he was the cause, asked the people to throw him into the sea. And finally, in verse 17, after the sailors did so, Jonah was swallowed by a great fish appointed by the Lord. That brings us to our passage today in Jonah chapter 2, in verses 1 to 10. In Jonah 2, 1 to 10, Jonah prayed to the Lord, and the Lord, having preserved Jonah, released him. Well, let's look at the passage verse by verse today. Jonah chapter 2, verse 1. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the fish's belly. The first chapter concluded with these words in Jonah 1 and 17. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. While in the fish's belly, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God, praising him who saved him from the deep and promised to worship him. In Jonah 2 and verse 10, it says, So the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. If one was to skip to the last passage, we would see verse 1, his prayer, and verse 10, his deliverance. In verses 2 to 9, we see a psalm of Jonah, a prayer. Jonah poetically described his affliction in the sea, his deliverance, and his renewal of devotion to the Lord. Verse 2, and he said, I cried out to the Lord because of my affliction, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. We know that the Lord had afflicted Jonah. Being in affliction, Jonah cried out to the Lord, and the Lord heard his voice and answered him. Jonah poetically described his affliction as being the belly of Sheol. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried. The Hebrew term here for Sheol is a transliteration of the Hebrew term, refers to the realm of the dead. In this version, in the New King James Version, the term is sometimes rendered as grave, pit, and hell. In the New Testament, Sheol is the equivalent of Hades in the Greek. And so this realm of the dead. In Psalm 6 and verse 5, for instance, he said, For in death there is no remembrance of you. In the grave, who will give you thanks? And so it is in this life that we give God praise. And we have this life, the opportunity to praise God. And so here we see in Psalm 6 and 5, death compared with the grave. And so that word grave, again, being that Hebrew word Sheol, or in the Greek, Hades. This appears to be a figurative description of his abode in this watery grave. Again, he's speaking poetically, figuratively. After being cast into the sea, he prayed. We see in chapter 2, verse 2 to verse 6. And he was delivered by the Lord, by the mouth of the fish. In the Old Testament, this term for affliction is translated various ways, such as distress and anguish, trouble, tribulation, and adversity. And some versions read distress in this passage for affliction. Another note in this particular verse, we want to mention how that Jonah does not mention the great fish in this psalm of prayer. Here he described the watery grave as the belly of Sheol. Again, this is probably an allusion to the belly of the fish, as we saw in the previous chapter. Now, poetically, he's speaking of the belly of Sheol. And so this belly of the realm of death. And so this watery grave that he found himself in, afflicted by the Lord. One who was cast into the sea could expect death. In the case of Jonah, we see the Lord. In chapter 2, in verse 3, he said, "For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your billows and your waves passed over me." Jonah writes how the Lord cast him into the depths of the seas. It was the mariners or the sailors who actually picked up Jonah and threw him into the sea. We saw that back in Jonah 1 and verse 15. However, the mariners threw him into the sea only after Jonah told them what they should do. Jonah, who received the commandment of God, told them to pick him up and throw him into the sea. Jonah 1 and verse 12. Here we see he said, "You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas." And so Jonah did not mention the sailors or the mariners, the captain of the ship. He did not mention himself. He mentioned that the Lord is the one. "You cast me into the deep." It was the word given to Jonah, apparently as prophet of God, which he in turn told to the people when they asked, "What should we do to you that the seas may be calm?" In this case here, "You cast me into the deep," referring to the Lord. Jonah described how the water of the sea was all around him. It was like floods. It was like floodwaters which surrounded him or inundated him. In the deep, these billows and waves of the sea are referred to as the waves of the Lord, your billows and your waves. Again, "You cast me into the sea." Your billows, your waves passed over me. This term billows, this great surge of water, these things were all attributed to the Lord by Jonah. This affliction that Jonah found himself in, Jonah is being afflicted by the Lord. Verse 4. "Then I said, I have been cast out of your sight. Yet I will look again towards your holy temple." Jonah had been cast out of the sight of the Lord. Again, the Lord cast him into the sea. He was afflicted, being cast into the sea by the Lord. And in this passage, there is indication of both the penitence and the hope of Jonah. He could not endure personally the displeasure of the Lord. He looked with hope to a time when he could again enter the presence of the Lord. And so he had attempted to flee from the presence of the Lord, from his responsibility in serving God as his servant and as preaching his word as his prophet. Certainly he could not escape his actual presence, the presence of his spirit, but he tried to escape his responsibility. Verse 5, and of course the temple in this passage, a reference here to the presence of the Lord. One day, for the time being, he's cast out of his sight because of his sin. But we see that he hoped again at one time to look again toward the holy temple of God. Verse 5, "The water surrounded me, even to my soul. The deep closed around me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. Here, Jonah poetically describes his situation in the sea, going down into this watery grave. Jonah was so inundated with water that his life was threatened. He said, even to my soul, and so even near my death, his life was threatened. He described how weeds were wrapped around his head. The term weeds here may refer to seaweeds being in the sea. The weeds wrapping around his head certainly give us, the reader, the image, the picture of Jonah being trapped and entangled in the sea. There was no freeing himself. There was no getting out of this situation. He tried to flee earlier, but there's no way he could flee the sea. Verse 6. I went down to the moorings of the mountains. The earth with its bars closed behind me forever. Yet you have brought up my life from the pit, O Lord, my God. In each of these verses, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now 6, we see Jonah in the sea, in this belly of Sheol, in this watery grave. It describes poetically here that he went down to the moorings of the mountains. An older version read the bottoms of the mountains. The roots, more modern versions read roots. The picture here is one of mooring a ship, a boat, in order to secure it with perhaps an anchor or some other means. And so to moor is to secure a boat by moorings or an anchor. And so he saw the foundation. He saw the bases of the mountains. Now, there's no need to think that he actually saw the moorings or the bottoms or the bases or the foundations of the mountains, only that he pictures a drear picture of how deep he was in the sea. How deep was he? Well, there's no need to know. There's no way to know, and it's really not important. But here he's describing poetically, metaphorically, that he's deep in the water. There's no getting out of this. And so he paints a picture of the depth and his distress in the sea. Now, as he descended below, and there's a picture of progressively sinking lower and lower. Now he's to the moorings of the mountains. He could see them. And so as he descended below into the sea, it was as if the earth had bars. Now again, he's speaking poetically in this passage, particularly verses 2 to 9, as he wrote this psalm of prayer to God. And so he's picturing the earth as though it had bars. He's sinking. So imagine him sinking into the water, deeper and deeper into the deep. And it's as though he's looking up towards the surface where the dry land was, and the earth as if it had bars closing behind him, as though prison doors were being shut. He's being punished. He's going down into the belly of Sheol, this watery grave of the sea. And so it's as though the bars of the earth closed behind him. There's no getting out. He said, close behind me forever. He said, yet you have brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. And so there's no escaping his punishment. However, as Jonah composed the psalm, he noted how the Lord, his God, brought up his life from the pit. And so there was no escape except by the hand of God. The term pit here may be a symbolic reference to the grave or to Sheol that we mentioned earlier. Sometimes that word Sheol is translated as pit or grave. Jonah 2 and verse 2, yet you have brought up my life from the pit, O Lord, my God. And so there was no getting out of it. He looked at it as a hopeless situation. and yet he remembered the Lord in prayer. He credits the Lord. He said, "You have brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God." In this particular instance, we may see the great fish mentioned earlier in verse 1, how that he had prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah. The Lord, in this case, brought up the life, and he may have brought up the life of Jonah by the great fish, which swallowed him. How long did it take after he was thrown into the sea before the great fish swallowed Jonah? Well, we're not told. And the immediate danger for Jonah was drowning in the sea. Sometime during his descent into the deep, and this poetic picture that he paints of his descent into this watery grave, the great fish swallows Jonah. And so we could picture this, not condemnation, but as his deliverance through the Lord by this great fish. And so he saved him. He brought up his life from the pit. Verse 7. When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer went up to you into your holy temple. So you imagine Jonah descending into the deep, sinking deeper and deeper into the sea. And he said, when my soul fainted. Remember earlier, he talks about his soul and how he was near death. When my soul fainted within me. And so when Jonah was fainting away, his life is going away, he remembered the Lord. It says how his prayer went up to the Lord before his presence in his holy temple. As we read earlier, Jonah prayed, crying out to the Lord because of his affliction, and the Lord answered him. Jonah 2, verses 1 and 2. Verse 8. Those who regard worthless idols forsake their own mercy. These last two verses of the Psalm of prayer describe his devotion to the Lord. Remember, he had told the mariners that he served the Lord. Jonah says that those who pay regard to worthless idols do so at the cost of their own mercy. They forsake their own mercy. He probably had told the mariners, or probably had the mariners, the fish, or the sailors in mind, who each cried out to his God. In Jonah 1 and 5, remember how in chapter 2 or chapter 1, the mariners, when they're on the sea with the great wind and the mighty tempest and the boat about to be broken up, each cried out to his God in turn. The captain went and woke Jonah up, who was sleeping down below in the ship, and told him to pray. We're not told whether he did or not. As far as we know, this is the first time that we see him praying as he's sinking down deep into the sea. And so Jonah might have had the sailors, the mariners in mind, who prayed to each his God, his idol God. And so idols, according to Jonah, are worthless. They're lying, they're vain. And so there's two aspects illustrated here by these worthless idols, how they are lying, how they are vain. And some older versions read lying vanities. Of course, these vanities are idols. And so to follow idols instead of trusting in the Lord is to forsake hope of mercy, the mercy that comes from the Lord. Jonah later says how the Lord is abundant in mercy or loving kindness. Jonah chapter 4 and verse 2. These words are found in Psalm 31 and verse 6 as well. He said, I have hated those who regard useless idols, but I trust in the Lord. The psalmist's trust was in the Lord, not in useless or worthless idols, these lying vanities. And so this word worthless here refers to something that is vain or useless. It indicates emptiness and futility. And depending on the context, this word for idols, as in worthless idols, can signify something that is vain or futile or worthless. And in this case here, it refers to these false gods, these worthless idols. Some versions read vain idols or worthless idols. Chapter 2 and verse 9. He said, "But I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. I will pay what I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord." And so while others prayed to idols, Jonah prayed and promised to sacrifice to the living God, to the Lord, the creator of the seas and the dry land. To sacrifice to the Lord with songs of thanksgiving. And so he promised to fulfill his vows and praise the Lord for his salvation, the God of his salvation. He said, salvation is of the Lord. Salvation is not of worthless idols, these lying vanities. Anybody who would be led astray by these worthless idols are falling for the lie. And the only thing that they'll receive from their devotion is vanity, futility, worthlessness. Verse 10. Jonah concludes the book by saying, in the chapter by saying, here in verse 10, so the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. After Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the fish's belly, the Lord answered Jonah. Jonah chapter 2, verse 1. As the Lord had prepared or had appointed, he had commanded the fish to swallow Jonah. The Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out onto dry land. The thing that I have to say here is, what a humbling scene. Can you imagine this? This prophet and servant of God who at one time probably had the favor of the people of Israel. We saw from Kings his prophecy and how the king and the kingdom was benefited. Now here, this prophet, this servant of the Lord, decides to try to flee from the presence of the Lord, to try to flee from the word or the commandment, the service of God. And he finds himself being tossed into the sea, near death, drowning in the sea, being rescued by the Lord, by this sea creature, whatever kind of sea creature it was, this great fish, swallowed. And through the preservation of the Lord, he later is vomited onto dry land. It's a humbling scene, to be sure. There's a number of questions, and we're not going to waste your time entertaining mere speculations. Our intention is to simply teach what the text is describing here in the book of Jonah. Once in a while, we might give some suggestions or some opinions, but in this particular case, there are so many questions. And just for a couple things to consider. Where was the place? Where was the place where Jonah was deposited onto dry land? Well, that's just 1 minute. We're not told, and we need to be content with that absence, that omission of the particular place. It's not important. It may be important to our curiosity, but we're simply not told, and it's not needed. Now, if I was to offer speculation, maybe it was Joppa, Jonah chapter 1, verse 3. That was, after all, the place where he departed from the dry land to the sea. That's where he paid fare to get on that ship to Tarshish and try to make Tarshish, but it ended up sometime later, the great wind, the mighty tempest arose and almost destroyed the ship, broke it up, and later on he was cast into the sea, and the sea calmed for the people on the ship. Joppa is as good a guess as any. Again, we're not told. Where did Jonah go after being vomited onto the land, after it expelled him onto the dry land? Where did he go? Again, we're not told. And so there's a space of time between the time that he was vomited onto the dry land and when he received the word of the Lord the second time in chapter 3 in verse 1. Now, we might have some speculation concerning where did he go? Well, what did he do prior to receiving the word of the Lord the second time? Well, he may have gone to the temple in Jerusalem in order to worship the Lord. Remember his vows earlier here in Jonah chapter 2? In Jonah chapter 2, verse 4, and then also in verse 7, he mentions the temple twice. And in verses 8 and 9, he talks about his sacrifice and thanksgiving and his vows that he intended to make to the Lord. And so maybe he went and began to make good on those promises and those vows and went to Jerusalem, to the temple, to worship God. But we're not told. So I'll leave that to you. I think if you read this chapter, Jonah 2, verse 1, and also verse 10, you see how that from the beginning, the Lord prepared this great fish which swallowed Jonah. Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. That is another way of saying he was in there 3 days, period of time. And so at the end of the chapter here, after his prayers and penitence, we see that the Lord spoke to the fish and it expelled him onto the shore, wherever that was. We hope that this has been helpful. And certainly, as we always say, there's more to learn. There's always more to learn. But I hope that this has been helpful in your study of the book of Jonah. And Lord willing, we'll continue with this great book next time in chapter 3. Until then, we wish God's blessing for you as you continue to study his word. Thank you for being here today.